The Subcommittee on Public Lands, Forests, and Mining will come to order. Today's subcommittee hearing is an oversight hearing to examine the long-term management options for the Bureau of Land Management Wild Horse and Burro program. Most observers will agree that the program is on a path that can only be described as unsustainable. Simply put, we have too many horses on our federal public lands, far more than was ever contemplated when the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act was signed into law back in 1971. According to BLM, the current on-range population consists of roughly 88,000 horses and burros, more than triple the Establishment Appropriate Management Level, or AML, which has been set at 27,000 animals. As a result, our public lands are suffering, and so too are the horses themselves and the burros. In arid environments like those found in Utah and in Nevada, where half of all wild horses are located, overpopulation quickly leads to overgrazing. The phrase, eats like a horse, isn't just a metaphor anymore. At least it's not a metaphor that's not borne out by something in fact. Public lands that exceed AML generally have less vegetative cover from overgrazing and are more susceptible to invasive plants like cheatgrass. Consistent overgrazing and hoof compaction also expose the soil to the elements, causing the land to become increasingly barren. And this is a process that's sometimes referred to as desertification. And when forage is diminished and water sources dry up, many native species have trouble surviving, including elk, mule deer, pronghorn antelope, and sage grouse. The 1971 Act directs the BLM to remove excess animals from the range to, quote, maintain a thriving natural ecological balance and multiple use relationship, close quote. We've long passed any semblance of multiple use management on the rangeland, however. As horse populations have grown out of control, the resources for livestock, along with the wildlife that attracts sportsmen and outdoor enthusiasts to the west, have become depleted. Last year, the BLM conducted more horse gathers than ever before, rounding up ultimately about 11,000 animals. Half of those were categorized by the BLM as emergency removals, in some cases animals that were emaciated, dehydrated, or at some imminent risk of death. These horses joined the nearly 50,000 others that are stored in off-range corrals or trucked to pastures somewhere in the Midwest, leased by the Bureau of Land Management. But holding facilities alone are not a long-term solution. They place a huge burden on American taxpayers, especially considering that wild horse populations grow by about 20% every year. And the BLM estimates the cost of caring for these horses at about $50,000 per animal over its lifetime. This ballooning expense is why the budget for the BLM Wild Horses program has quadrupled since 2002 and now it exceeds $85 million per year, with costs steadily rising each year. Unfortunately, restrictions enacted in annual appropriations laws actually prohibit the sale of horses for commercial processing. As a result, the BLM largely relies on animal adoption programs and on a restricted sale program to dispose of the excess animals. As laudable as the adoption program is, it's never going to outpace on-range foaling rates under the current model. And for a variety of reasons, the deployment of existing fertility control drugs has not proven as effective as hoped. Some herds are too remote to be routinely gathered and treated, and research into other fertility control options, including sterilization, is often the subject of litigation. During today's hearing, I look forward to hearing testimony about the current crisis we're facing on the rangeland. I also welcome the views of the representatives of cattlemen and of the animal welfare community, whose organizations have been working hard to address it. And I'm confident that together we can find solutions to protect our lands and our ecosystem and to preserve the health of our wild horses. It's now time to hear from our witnesses. We have 5 witnesses joining us today. The first is Mr. Steve Tryon, the Deputy Assistant Director for Resources and Planning at the Bureau of Land Management. Second is Dr. Eric Thacker, a Professor of Wildland Resources at Utah State University. Thank you for joining us. Next, we have Ethan Lane, the Chairman of the National Horse and Burro Rangeland Management Coalition. We're also joined by Nancy Perry, the Vice President of Government Relations at the American Society for the Preservation of Cruelty to Animals. And finally, Dr. Goycochea, the Chairman of the Eureka County Board of Commissioners in Nevada. At the end of the witness testimonies, members will be able to ask questions. Your full witness testimony will be made part of the official record. Please keep your statements to 5 minutes so that we have time for questions. I look forward to hearing from your testimony from each of you. Mr. Tryon, we'll start with you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lee and members of the subcommittee. I'm Steve Tryon, the Deputy Assistant Director for Resources and Planning at the Bureau of Land Management. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Bureau of Land Management's Wild Horse and Burro program. BLM manages wild horse and burro herds on approximately 27 million acres of public lands located in 10 western states, under the authority of the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act. The Act directs the BLM to manage these herds as populations of healthy animals in balance with other uses of the public lands while maintaining the health and productive capacity of the range. This dual statutory mandate presents considerable management challenges for the BLM. The Bureau takes into account all natural resources and authorized uses of the public lands, consistent with our multiple use and sustained yield mandate set out in the Federal Land Policy and Management Act and the Wild Horse and Burro Act. The BLM has determined that the appropriate management level, or AML, for wild horses and burros on the range west-wide is approximately 27,000 animals. And as you noted, Mr. Chairman, the BLM now estimates that as of March of this year, more than 88,000 wild horses and burros are currently on BLM-managed public lands. As herd populations exceed AML, forage and water resources become depleted, threatening the overall health of the public rangelands and degrading ecosystems. With insufficient forage and water to support herds, the physical health of animals declines, which leads to starvation, dehydration, and eventually death. Consequently, this limits forage and water for native wildlife species and permitted livestock grazing. Since wild horses have virtually no natural predators and herds double in size approximately every 4 years, the BLM's primary tool to ensure that herd sizes are consistent with the rangeland's capacity to support them has been to gather excess wild horses and burros and remove them from the range. In addition to the animals on range, as of May of this year, the BLM manages almost 50,000 animals in off-range holding facilities. That figure is striking. The original authors of the Wild Horse and Burro Act could never have contemplated that nearly 50 years after its enactment, we would be indefinitely caring for nearly twice as many animals as the law was intended to protect on the range. After gathers occur, wild horses and burros removed from the range enter short-term holding facilities where they are prepped for adoption and sale, as well as receiving veterinary care. And this is all prior to being moved to long-term pastures. Unless these animals are able to be placed with responsible owners, the BLM will spend more than $1 billion total to care for and feed them during the remainder of their lives. The BLM currently spends over 60% of the program's budget, nearly $50 million in 2018, to care for animals removed from the range. Given this significant financial commitment, our ability to remove additional animals from the range is constrained. To overcome this challenge, the BLM is pursuing a comprehensive population growth suppression strategy and is taking actions to increase placement of horses and burros into good homes through training and financial incentives. Since 1971, the BLM has placed nearly 250,000 animals into private care. However, over the past 10 years, the number of excess animals gathered has outpaced adoptions. We have recently initiated a new program this year called the Adoption Incentive Program that seeks to encourage new individuals and new organizations to adopt untrained wild horses and burros by paying a small incentive. Over 1,000 animals have been adopted and placed into good homes during the first few months of this program. The BLM is encouraged by recent efforts of interested parties, including the groups that join me on the witness table today, to promote sustainable horse and burro populations on healthy rangelands. The BLM is committed to working with Congress and stakeholders to develop a sustainable wild horse and burro program. Thank you again for the opportunity to present this testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Thacker, Dr. Thacker.
Thank you, Chairman Lee. My name is Eric Thacker. I'm an associate professor at Utah State University in rangeland science. We're here today because we are facing a dilemma in the West with exponential growth of wild horse and burro populations on fragile rangeland ecosystems. When managing grazing, rangeland managers carefully control the number, how many animals, the time, how long the grazing occurs, the timing, the season of use, and the intensity, how much forage will be removed of livestock to ensure that forage and water resources are not damaged. Often controlling the number of animals is the easiest option. Different grazing management strategies can be implemented, which vary the time, the timing, the intensity, the number of animals to meet a variety of management outcomes. Similarly, wildlife managers manage wildlife populations to ensure the sustainability, long-term sustainability of habitat through using hunting to remove excess animals or hunting pressure to move animals around the landscape. It's also been noted that their natural predators help regulate native wildlife populations, which in turn helps to control population growth and protect habitat. Free-roaming wild horses and burros have no natural predators. Therefore, they lack population regulatory mechanisms to limit population growth. If left unmanaged, wild horse and burro populations will grow rapidly until forage resources are diminished and individual horse fitness declines. As individual horse fitness declines, the consequences are lower pregnancy rates, lower foal survival, lower adult survival, thus limiting the population growth of the horses. However, the problem this creates is catastrophic. Horses are quite resilient, so by the time that these negative consequences are felt, the range has been severely degraded and maybe have received permanent damage. Therefore, managing wild horse populations is one of the most critical aspects of the wild horse management to maintain a thriving ecological balance. The reality is that some herd management areas are already showing signs of degradation due to excess wild horses. Research has concluded that too many horses will lead to a loss of vegetation, which leads to more bare ground, soil loss, loss of forage. This also reduces the quality and quantity of wildlife habitat. Excess wild horses and burros can also negatively impact water resources. Research has shown that the presence of wild horses reduce the diversity and species richness of native wildlife species found using bodies of water in Utah. If wild horse and burro populations continue to grow exponentially, rangeland and wildlife damage will increase exponentially as well. Currently, the BLM has limited options to manage wild horse and burro populations. The BLM and the Forest Service conduct limited gathers in an attempt to round up horses and adopt them. They have explored the use of contraceptives and have found some limited success. However, the current gather and adopt management is not working. Some suggest that allocating more land may be the answer. With the rapid growth of horses and burros, though, that additional land would be used up fairly quickly. We are in a triage situation. If we do nothing, there could be 500,000 horses by 2030 at the current growth rates. The complexity of the wild horse and burro problem suggests that removal of excess horses coupled with population control strategies, contraception and sterilization, and increased adoptions to maintain adequate population levels may be the best approach. We must rely on collaborative solutions that identify palatable management options from a diverse group of stakeholders that understand and recognize the reality of the wild horse and burro problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thacker. Mr. Lane.
Chairman Lee, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to testify. My name is Ethan Lane. I'm the Executive Director of the Public Lands Council. I'm the Senior Executive Director for Federal Lands at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, where I oversee federal lands, ESA, and wildlife policy. And currently, I'm the chairman of the National Horse and Burro Rangeland Management Coalition. The Horse and Burro Rangeland Management Coalition consists of a diverse national group of livestock, sportsmen, and wildlife groups that collectively speak for 10 million Americans. Those Americans seek responsible management of wild horses and burros on western rangelands and solutions to address exploding populations in those environments. In modern agriculture, we talk a lot about the urban-rural divide, specifically as it relates to average Americans becoming detached from the farm and unaware of where their food comes from or how it gets from the grocery store to their plate. It occurred to me, however, that while preparing this testimony, perhaps the best example of that urban-rural divide is this wild horse and burro issue. Suburban voters, by and large detached from their food supply, and rural America in general, feel an emotional attachment to these animals, and understandably so. I represent an industry that cares for animals professionally, and I can say every man and woman in that industry also cares for these animals. We hear stories constantly from our members that watch these animals starving on western rangelands, and their reaction is every bit as intense, I can assure you, as any activist sitting behind me or that engages in this issue on a daily basis. But just like their lack of understanding of where their food comes from, often some of these voters also lack an understanding of what is required to manage a rapidly expanding non-native species in an often resource-scarce environment. Predictably, this emotional connection and lack of understanding has led to a congressional response that, quite frankly, has been anything but helpful. The Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971 provided the BLM with both responsibilities and resources, tools and options by which to manage excess populations. 15 years ago, as Chairman Lee mentioned, in response to those well-intentioned voters, Congress saw fit to undermine its own congressional intent by introducing a rider to the Interior Appropriations Bill that removes the most effective of BLM's management tools, unlimited sale and euthanasia chief among them. That rider has remained in every spending bill since, always appearing in the base bill and never requiring members to take a tough vote that may alienate voters on either side of this issue. The result of this approach has been nothing short of catastrophic. 31,700 horses were on range in 2005 when the rider first appeared. 6 years later, that number was 38,497. As the chairman indicated earlier, that number today is 88,000 on range and climbing at 20% a year, with 50,000 in long-term holding. The trajectory of on-range population is not in dispute, and current management will guarantee an on-range population, as Dr. Thacker indicated, of 500,000 by 2029. That predicament brings us to today. It's clear that the 10 million Americans I speak for today advocate for the full use of the Wild Horse and Burro Act as the most effective means of reducing overpopulation. It's equally clear to those Americans that that is an untenable political solution for this body. The courage simply does not exist, and I mean that with all the respect in the world. That is a tough vote for this body to take. Therefore, we are at a point where we have to find new solutions to this problem. As such, we're here today asking Congress to do something to help us curb this problem. The time to act is now, and the proposal that was submitted with my testimony, I believe with others as well, is one possible path back to sustainability. It relies on three key tenets. The first of which is gathering sufficient numbers to curb this population. We will see 18,000 new horses on range this year. BLM's upward capacity to manage to gather horses in a single year is probably about in line with that as we understand it. That means next year's 20,000 horses will outstrip their ability to stay up with current population. We must also administer population growth suppressant to every horse that's gathered in one way or another. Last year they gathered 11,000 horses, they treated 700. That is not going to address this problem. And finally, they must identify long-term holding solutions that are sustainable and effective and cost-effective enough to allow those horses to remain if we are not going to use those other methods long enough to curb this growth on range and get the population back down to a sustainable level. I thank the committee and look forward to any questions they may have.
Thank you, Mr. Lane. Ms. Perry.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lee, Senator Cortez Masto, and all the members of the subcommittee. My name is Nancy Perry, and I'm Senior Vice President of Government Relations for the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Thank you for inviting me today to testify on the fate of these precious herds. Founded in 1866, the ASPCA was the first humane organization established in the Americas. We have always been committed to equine welfare. In our early years, our focus was on improving medical care, and we actually invented the first equine operating table and ambulance. Nowadays, we work to improve the welfare of horses through rehoming and safety nets and legal protections. Our efforts to protect wild horses were initially focused on documenting and pressing for changes in the field during roundups and in corrals. We were greatly distressed by problems we saw with roundups, but that work was simply not getting to the root of the problem due to BLM's emphasis on removals rather than on on-range management. In order to truly protect horses, we need this program to shift away from a reactive approach to a proactive one, a preventative strategy using existing fertility control methods would enable the BLM to phase out the costly and harmful cycle of large-scale roundups and removals that has led to imbalance and an unsustainable situation. Mr. Chairman, the status quo is broken. It is putting our horses and burros in jeopardy, and it's costly for taxpayers. For decades, the scientific community has been urging the BLM to employ currently available and highly effective fertility control tools. Our work with ecologists and economists reviewing population dynamics confirmed that these tools already offer a real solution, one that will bring relief for horses and taxpayers alike. To our surprise, many who have long been opponents on this issue were willing to set aside their advocacy for lethal methods and endorse the proposal we have come up with. We are pressing for a paradigm shift in management using 4 basic components: widespread implementation of fertility control combined with simultaneous short-term targeted removals, supported by public-private partnerships that will create lower-cost lifetime pastures for animals off the range, further augmented by strategies to increase safe adoptions. If done properly, starting in year 4, the removal numbers can steadily decrease. And by the end of year 5, no more horses would go into long-term holding because the number of removals would come into equilibrium with the number of adoptions. By the end of year 5 also, costs start falling. This can all be done without killing horses and burros to reduce population and without selling any horses or burros to slaughter. For the humane community, that is essential because it is our responsibility collectively to manage these herds, and it would not be right to force them to pay the price of our failure with their lives. It would also spark the greatest crisis in public confidence in the BLM and a true political meltdown. Our proposal also requires the agency and its contractors to be held accountable to its own comprehensive animal welfare program, which covers gathers, transport, and handling on and off the range. The science supporting the use of fertility control is clear, and it has been for some time. Starting in 1990, the GAO began urging the BLM to implement fertility control as less expensive than removals. BLM proclaimed fertility control effective in its 1992-95 report. Fish and Wildlife Service affirmed its efficacy in the 1998 final rule. BLM repeated its confidence in this tool in a 2003 report to Congress. A 2006 U.S. House of Representatives report strongly urged BLM to move forward with fertility control, citing U.S. Geological Survey studies showing a $7.7 million savings. BLM's 2008 report to Congress confirms the effective use of fertility control and cites the National Park Service successes. A 2009 BLM instructional memoranda proclaims the tool effective and a cost saver. BLM's own EA in 2011 on the McCullough Peaks herd states that liquid PZP is 95% effective. The tools exist now to make this program work, and we hope the BLM will take full advantage of this rare opportunity of a united community of disparate interests and lean into this effort with all of its might. We stand ready to help, and we hope that Congress will invest in this solution rather than the antiquated and expensive status quo. This strategy will enable our free-roaming herds to live into the future in a sustainable way, on the range where they belong. Thank you for this opportunity to share our thoughts in this truly pivotal moment for our wild Mustangs and burros. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Goycochea.
Thank you, Chairman Lee, members of the committee. My name is Dr. J.J. Goycochea. I'm a fourth-generation cattle rancher from Eureka, Nevada. I'm also a licensed veterinarian and the current County Commission Chairman Board. I'm in my second term as a county commissioner. I was in private practice for 17 years before being named a Nevada State Veterinarian in February of 2016. While my comments today are going to reflect my views and those of Eureka County. The issues surrounding the management of wild horses and burros in the West are not new. We've had these conversations. Since the passage of the Wild and Free-Roaming Horse and Burro Act of 1971, there's been a lot of concern regarding how the animals and the natural resources they rely on are being managed. Eureka County understands and recognizes these concerns, and we express our support for recent recommendations to better manage wild horses. The BLM and Congress have lacked the fortitude to accept and work towards implementation of difficult but necessary recommendations. While Eureka County has policy supporting the use of all tools authorized under the Wild and Free-Roaming Horse and Burro Act of 1971 as amended, that includes the sale and humane euthanasia of excess horses that are unadoptable. We have compromised and we have agreed to the non-lethal management approaches set forth in a recent proposal entitled The Path Forward for the Management of BLM's Wild Horses and Burros. We've all heard the numbers from March of 2019, 88,000 horses on the range in the West. Let me say that Nevada has right at 47,500 horses. 47,500. That's nearly double what AML is in all of the West. We are ground zero. Nevada's horse population has reached a level that must be addressed now to avoid exponential growth in the coming years and that eventual starvation, as Dr. Thacker alluded to. An example of some of the challenges we have in Nevada are Nevada's BBB HMA. It is over 1.2 million acres in size, and the current population this spring was 1,500 horses. Keep in mind there was a gather conducted there last summer to keep horses from starving to death. And there is another gather currently occurring as we speak in that same area. The Pancake HMA, 850,000 acres. Those two alone are over 2 million acres and they are adjacent to each other. The Pancake HMA had an emergency gather done in August of 2018 due to horses again dying and resource damage. And this spring, that HMA was 508% of AML. That's after a gather being done last year. The Fish Creek HMA, right outside Eureka, a prime example of an HMA that doesn't even fit the definition of a natural balance. This HMA has never been at AML since it was established. From 1994 to 2002, with the exception of 1 year, there was no livestock grazing at all in that HMA, and yet utilization levels were moderate to severe in the Antelope Valley portion of that allotment. It is at 358% of AML today. I mentioned Fish Creek for this reason. In 1997, there was an EA to use PZP in the Fish Creek HMA to bring that population within AML in 19 years. It's 22 years later. We are at 358%. We must not continue to do the same thing like we have in the past. The hit and miss application of fertility control is not working. In our larger HMAs, we need a different approach, and this may include the use of permanent surgical sterilization or other long-acting methods, such as IUDs, intrauterine devices, currently being tested in domestic horses. The use of surgical sterilization will require additional handling of animals and require a longer stay in holding corrals. But this is again cheaper than repeated roundups and re-administration of a product, or God forbid, lack of funding and the products are not administered. Advances in surgical techniques and improved methods of analgesia continue to allow for more rapid recoveries and less postoperative complications in horses undergoing surgical procedures. I applaud the BLM for conducting studies to prove the safety and efficacy of surgical techniques. I would never condone unsafe or inappropriate techniques or drugs, be used, but as a scientific professional, I would also not be so foolish as to not adopt more efficient tools once provided safe and effective. I tell you these things today not as a lobbyist or a government employee or an activist. Plain and simple, I'm a ranch kid that found his way to vet school, and I've spent the rest of my life applying what I learned to care for animals. I'm tired of seeing horses die, I'm tired of seeing horses suffer, and I'm tired of watching the rangelands I love and work so hard to protect be degraded. I'm tired of the status quo, as is Miss Perry. We can no longer turn a blind eye. We need Congress's action now. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for your statements. We'll now open up the process for questions. We'll have alternating time slots between Republicans and Democrats. I want to start by asking a couple of questions jointly of Dr. Thacker and of Mr. Tryon. Feel free to jump in either time either of you can respond to this. As far as I've been able to tell, the last time a hearing was conducted here on this issue was 2002. Can either of you tell me roughly how large the wild horse and burro population was on federal lands in 2002?
I don't have that statistic immediately at my, but
Okay.
it looks like Dr. Thacker may.
That's fantastic. It is not essential if you don't have it. My understanding is that it has increased substantially since then. So
Yes, sir.
Let me know if you come across that. Under current management practices, if nothing changes, how many horses do you think will there be 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now? What does the rate of increase look like?
So I'll take an initial answer at that, sir. We expect the recruitment rate for the 88,000 horses that have been mentioned to be roughly 16,000 animals that will overwinter. That's how many will be born and will survive through the winter, which could increase to as many as 20,000 the following year if there are no other interventions, if we do not scale up contraceptive use or scale up removals of animals. And I believe you quoted a figure of as many as 500,000 animals if the program goes on in its current glide path.
In what time period would that occur? Would be up to
So
500?
by 2029, 2030, if no more horses are removed, given the apparent growth rate will be at about 500,000 horses, give or take a few.
Okay. Can you explain to us why wild horse populations grow at such rates, at such exponential rates?
As I mentioned in my testimony, part of the problem is they're a non-native species and there are no natural predators. So like with other wildlife species, you have predators that help control those populations, or we actually manage those as humans. Wild horses don't have any natural predators, so basically by the time a foal reaches a year old, the chance of it living to 15 plus years is quite high. So there's no other natural large ungulates or herbivores that live in our western landscapes that experience that kind of growth or survival.
Right. So in the case of cattle, they're typically being managed by someone who owns them. In the case of something else, they might have a natural predator.
Right. Well, cattle are not allowed to grow exponentially because they're managed. On public land specifically, they're managed very tightly by the BLM and the Forest Service, again, prescripting timing, intensity, and the numbers. And so those animals are usually managed quite tightly.
Mr. Tryon, is there any scenario in which fertility control alone bring an overpopulated herd to AML?
I think there is a scenario. It's going to require a significant investment. So fertility control from the BLM's perspective is all of the above. We will use Gonacon and PZP in 2 formulations. PZP's been mentioned by a couple of the witnesses already. We certainly would be interested in looking at the effectiveness of IUDs as a research project. And BLM is very much open to the idea of spay and neuter or sterilization, particularly for the mares, where it's going to be more effective. This is not a technique that at the $80 million budget that we're operating at can get us to appropriate management level without the additional gather and removals that are going to have to accompany it.
Why not go in that direction, toward the sterilization, and if that would be effective?
We are intending to do so, Mr. Chairman. In fact, we've been pursuing a study in Burns, Oregon for a couple of years now, which we intend to go forward with in the fall, that looks at behavioral characteristics of mares that have been spayed once they've been reintroduced to the field, which is one of the questions that the public has about sterilization. And certainly we would be open to using spay and neuter techniques in gathers throughout the West. It is something that we need to gather additional data on, but we're very much open to it.
Are there herds in which overpopulation has led to starvation?
Yes, and I believe Dr. Thacker has said as much, but BLM last summer, so in 2018, had to intervene in roughly half of the gathers of the 11,000 animals that you mentioned. Roughly half of those were in some amount of distress because the interior West was going through a substantial drought in 2018. And so rather than haul water to water sources over months and sometimes into years, our direction was instead to gather the animals, get them down to AML, and make sure that the water that was present there was sufficient for the appropriate management level.
Okay. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. I appreciate all of you being here. Thank you so much. Coming from Nevada, this is an issue that we need to do something about. Time is of the essence. No more can we delay. So I appreciate the hearing today. Ms. Perry, let me start with you. I recently had the opportunity to meet with advocates in northern Nevada to learn about their work darting wild horses with PZP. And it was in the Fish Springs area, right, at the Pine Nut Herd Management area. So I know the compromise plan refers to using a variety of fertility control methods. We heard from the BLM just now that they think that's a possibility. But I also know that you've also identified that each management area, or each herd management area is different, right? Not one size fits all. So can you talk a little bit about not only the efficacy of the PZP, but other methods that have shown promise to controlling the population?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Senator. There really is quite a history around PZP, and the new generation of PZP, 22, which is named after the number of months it typically lasts for, and that's just a median. So it actually can last for somewhere between 2 and 5 years if there's a booster involved. So it's quite efficacious. The stacks of research on that have really impressed us, and we really believe that if implemented robustly, it would be adequate to bring us the kind of results we all collectively want to see. But unfortunately, the spending has not happened around that. For the last several years, the agency has devoted less than 1% of its overall budget to situations like Fish Springs and Cedar Mountain and some of the other HMAs where there have been concerted efforts to implement immunocontraception. There are other techniques, Gonacon, there's a Spayvac vaccine, essentially, that still needs more field testing, but is showing incredible results. There really is a lot of research going on right now that reaches into reversible techniques, some more permanent techniques. It's all, it's really quite impressive the amount of energy that's going into looking into this. But right now, we feel that the tools actually already exist. And one of the concerns we have is if we're constantly striving and reaching for some new tool when we have something effective in our hands, it feels like a very inefficient program for us to not employ the tools that we already have. Those were created using taxpayer funds.
Right.
And we're not really utilizing the tools that are in our hands right now.
So thank you. And I guess let me ask Mr. Tryon, because you've mentioned it as well, and I heard Ms. Perry just say this, that less than 1% of your budget goes to fertility control. Why?
So let's use last year as an example, Senator. In 2018, as has been mentioned, we gathered and removed about 11,000 animals. That was roughly 5,000 animals less than the recruitment rate. So as we were managing the program, it did not make a lot of management sense to simply turn those animals back onto the range when the places we were taking them from were 2, 3, or 4 times above the appropriate management level to start. So it has generally been the BLM's approach to say, as we get closer to the AML level, that's when extensive use of fertility control would make more sense. Because as we gather and remove animals from the range, they're segregated by gender. So they have no possibility after the foal that the mare may be carrying is born, they have no possibility of producing more horses and burros.
But at the rate you're going,
that's
you're never
why.
going to get to that AML level. So it just doesn't make sense to me. Why wouldn't you change your tactics if you know what you're doing is, quite frankly, swimming upstream? You're just never going to reach that AML level based on what you're doing and hearing. And what I've just heard now is by 2020, we're going to have 100,000 horses out there now. So why wouldn't we change tactics and look at fertility control and spending more money there, or asking us here in Congress to appropriate more money if that's what there is a long-term plan to address this?
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Senator. Of course, we spent a lot of time meeting with some of these coalition representatives and going over the details of their report. Generally, the BLM is supportive of additional fertility control, and it is something that within the constraints of our appropriation, we would like to use additional fertility control, and we would like to continue to increase the amount of removals.
So let me ask, and I'm running short of time, but Dr. Goycochea, it's great to see you. Somebody I've talked to on a regular basis, and many of our ranchers and stakeholders in Nevada. Based on your experience and knowing that Nevada has most of the wild horses on our land, your thoughts on whether and how BLM should be doing more when it comes to control through fertilization, through fertility control methods, in your thoughts, particularly as a veterinarian?
Thank you, Senator. And Ms. Perry is correct. PZP 22 does show great promise in those areas where it can be re-administered. The reason I talked about the acreage in these HMAs is to paint a picture for you guys of just exactly how large that is. It must be re-administered. I encourage you to please reach out to contractors who contract gather for the BLM, and they will tell you the same. We're having difficulty recapturing horses. The more times you put a horse in the corral and release that horse, the more difficult they get to capture. We have a lot of pinyon juniper woodlands. We have some high elevation peaks. We can't get those same horses back. If we miss her the next time, she will have a viable foal. She is in much better health. We must find something that works better for areas of Nevada. Nevada is a unique beast, as you well know, and this will not, the use of PZP every 3 years, I'm sorry, it won't work in our large HMAs. We must have something more long-term.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Notice my time is up. Thank you.
We're going to turn to Senator Barrasso next. He will have 5 minutes of questioning, then we'll be recessing because they called votes on the floor, and we'll reconvene after we return from votes. Senator Barrasso.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to congratulate and tell you how much I appreciate you and the committee taking up the animal welfare and environmental crisis that is the current state of the Bureau of Land Management's Wild Horse and Burro Management program. I'm going to, if it's okay with you, just submit my statement for the record and go right to questions.
Without objection.
So, Mr. Tryon, although this issue is often litigated in the court of public opinion, the wild horse and burro problem is no stranger to the court of law. One particular case in Wyoming was brought by the Rock Springs Grazing Association to require the BLM to gather horses that had left the herd management area and encroached on association land. You're familiar with this. I'm sure you're familiar with the 2013 consent decree came as a result of the case. So if it implemented, would the approach suggested by the coalition's proposal change anything about the way the BLM carries out that consent decree?
Senator, thank you for the question. I'm generally familiar with the Rock Springs consent decree, and BLM has full intent to continue to comply with it. I would say generally to be in alignment with the coalition proposal means greater use of fertility control. In the case of Rock Springs, it would be no different. That could be one of the areas that we target through a pilot. It's a little unusual because of the checkerboard private ownership. Yeah. But generally, BLM would like to use additional fertility control and also to increase its pace of gather and removals, both, including in Rock Springs.
A couple of quick questions to compare the proposal to the BLM's current approach. The proposal suggests the agency should prioritize removals based on heightened concerns due to rangeland degradation and the direct political conflict with the BLM's multiple use mandate. So is that different than how the agency prioritizes gathers now?
I wouldn't say it is. Our priorities generally involve health and safety of the animals, health and safety of humans, target species such as sage grouse, and rangeland degradation.
And the proposal also suggests that range restoration treatment should be done quote, immediately following gather. So based on the significant degradation in some of these areas, would treatments be effective if horses were still present? Would horses need to be removed in terms of to allow for recovery?
It's a little difficult to give a blanket statement about that. I would say in the event of a fire, we absolutely will get all of the horses off of there to ensure that revegetation takes, and that could be as long as a couple of years.
And Ms. Perry, I appreciate the ASPCA now recognizing the need to gather horses on drastically overstocked herd management areas. Gathers seem to attract litigation as soon as they're announced. Some of the suits have been brought even by your own organization. So I welcome the engagement and the support for this proposal from the ASPCA, the Humane Society, and others. But I know that any action the BLM takes is likely to be met with litigation. So will the ASPCA stand with the BLM and other supporters of this proposal when groups tend to sue to prevent necessary management?
Thank you, Senator. I'm unaware of any litigation that we have engaged in as a group, but what you say is true, that this program in general has drawn a great deal of ire and concern and skepticism from many, many different categories of animal welfare and rights groups. And we expect that that will continue to be the case. Our role is not to continue to engage in pointing fingers, because we think that has delayed solutions that are needed for these animals that we're working so hard to protect. We believe that if this particular proposal or something very similar to it were implemented, we would be able to be supportive if it's implemented faithfully, because we believe in it and we believe it will yield positive results. There will still be litigation, there will still be detractors, and we appreciate and understand that there's a certain amount of passion out there, and we will never eliminate that. But the ASPCA certainly will stand for moving forward with a proposal that we believe is non-lethal and protective and long-term and will bring lasting change. Part of the problem has been that we have to worry about every political wind shift and what may or may not happen for these horses. We need a sustained approach so that these horses receive the kind of protection they need over the long haul and they exist into the future.
Mr. Lane, I can imagine chairing this diverse coalition is challenging at times. Understandably, some of the provisions in the proposal are a bit vague, so just a couple quick questions. The proposal suggests the BLM should more aggressively seek lower-cost, off-range holding facilities as an alternative to BLM corrals. There aren't many facilities like that exist now. Where do you think these facilities are going to emerge, and if they exist, why haven't they come forward already?
You know, I think that's a fair question, and part of the conversation that took shape, I think, during this process was an analysis of where you put these horses once you remove them from rangelands. And one of the concerns that we had coming into that process is that we don't remove them and place them into facilities that are adjacent to problematic areas. Partially because of the litigation that you referred to earlier, there's not an issue we deal with in the West in land management that doesn't come down to litigation, unfortunately, at some point. So what we tried to prioritize in the proposal was locating those horses into areas where there are resources to support them. Obviously, one of the things we'd be concerned with would be putting them into areas that are already resource deprived, where you're starting to impact the hay market, where you're starting to impact other ranchers that are in the area. So that RFP process needs to be robust enough that producers, whether it be ranchers or others with sizable land areas and forage production, able to support those horses that want to be in that business, can be attracted to that program as an option, either to hedge in the rest of their operation or simply because they have the resources and the will to do it.
And the final question for you is one of the biggest struggles for this issue is that all sides have been tried in the court of public opinion. Biology, ecology, law. How does the coalition work to educate the public so that they engage in a way that is actually helpful to the horses, helpful to the BLM, helpful to the effort?
So, and I want to just make a quick distinction. I'm representing a coalition, and then we have this proposal group. And just to distinguish between the two, I think in the proposal group, we do have a lot of disparate opinions, as Nancy alluded to earlier, and it is really the responsibility of various members of this proposal group to speak to their own constituencies. I mean, what I say as a lobbyist for the cattle industry, and as the chairman of this coalition, carries no weight with members of Nancy's universe, and vice versa. So, I think our responsibility is to craft something that's realistic and saleable to you here in Congress and to the BLM, and then to go communicate that to our memberships. I mean, all of us sitting at this table that engaged in this did so with policy books sitting in front of us and guidance from our members. And we then need to go back and communicate what we've done and do it in a way that helps them to understand the political reality and what's possible and achievable in this environment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your continued leadership on this.
Thank you, Senator Brasser. We stand adjourned. We will reconvene shortly after the votes occur on the floor. We'll now reconvene. Senator McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks all of you for your testimony on this really important topic. Most of the hearing so far has been focused on wild horses, but I want to remind everybody that in Arizona, we have a burro problem as well. More burros than in any other state. There's approximately 6,900 burros, mainly in Mojave County and in Yuma County, where the maximum carrying capacity determined by BLM is just 1,600. The extreme population has crowded out native wildlife. It's been damaging fragile ecosystems, impacting ranching operations, and they wander into populated areas, causing a lot of safety issues. In 2015, the Arizona Department of Transportation responded to a record number of calls about burros wandering on the highways, with 44 animals being killed across the state. And in 2018, 21 burros were killed by car collisions just in Bullhead City alone. I did a 15-county tour in my first 90 days in office, and when I went out to Mojave County, this was a top issue that local community brought to my attention. So far, thank God, drivers have only experienced minor injuries in these collisions, but they could also lead to human fatalities as well if left unaddressed. So I want to talk a little bit about the burro population. So, Mr. Tryon, I understand BLM is looking into expanding the use of fertility drugs with the burros, with wild burros, with a plan that the agency expects to release in August. Is there a cost difference between administering the contraceptives to burros versus horses? And can you explain why that may be the case?
Senator McSally, thanks for the opportunity to talk about burros and maybe make a small plug for the BLM's operations in your home state. As far as fertility control is concerned, there is not a substantial cost difference because the majority of the cost of administering contraceptives is actually running a gather itself. Now, my qualifier on that is burros in Arizona are largely gathered through what we call bait trap methods, which is really putting out water, which is attractive to burros, and the operation can take several weeks, but it is both low cost and highly effective. And so a small shout out to our BLM operations there. We adopt 300, 400, 500 animals a year out of Arizona, and they go to various states, including Utah and Wyoming and other places, because they're quite adoptable and people find them attractive. Generally speaking, what we've been talking about with fertility control is BLM is welcome to using more of it, including with burro populations. And that would mean that burros are not just gathered and removed and put up for adoption. Some would be gathered and reintroduced.
Okay, great. Just to be clear, so you're saying there's no real cost difference between burro and horse fertility projects, but I mean, it's easier to gather up the burros, right? And
Right,
for lower
right.
cost.
So the gather itself would be cheaper if you're talking about bait trap.
Okay.
And so that would be a cost difference.
Okay, but that's all part of the cost,
It's inherent
right?
to the way the gathers run. And we do bait trap operations in Nevada and other states as well.
Okay, thanks. As you guys, as BLM is preparing your report on this issue, I think, again, it's due in August, could you place an appropriate emphasis on the unique and separate operations and needs related to the burro management than the horse management, so we're not just lumping them all in together. Can I get that commitment from you?
I will commit to doing that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Are there and several other experts on the panel here today who want to share their perspectives on best practices related to burro management? I'm open to hearing your ideas.
Thank you so much, Senator. I just wanted to echo what Mr. Tryon said, that we find, whether domestic or wild, burros are one of those species that enjoys incredible popularity, and there are sanctuaries and rescues that can move thousands of them out to good homes. So we're pretty impressed with that, and we think there's an opportunity for expansion of that work that would really address what you're raising.
Great, thanks. I know there's a pilot project, HSUS,
Yes.
which you're not representing, but also
Yes, the
in
Platero
welfare
project.
industry that's happening there, and that includes private donations as well to support the operation.
Yes.
Is there hope in expanding that element of this? Because funding obviously is an issue that's been brought up many times today.
There is. There are many humane groups who are part of this larger proposal that we support, and the Humane Society of the U.S., Humane Society Legislative Fund, Return to Freedom are all part of that, and HSUS has been actively working on the ground with the Platero project. And in Oatman, there are several locations where that has been on the ground, and I believe there is interest in expansion, and it is a public-private opportunity.
Great, I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Anybody else have anything to add related to burros? All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this important issue.
Thank you, Senator McSally. Dr. Thacker, an estimated 30% of the land covered by the BLM herd management areas contains sage-grouse habitat. That amounts to about 7 million acres. As you know, state governments are investing a lot of money and a lot of other resources to manage the rangeland for sage-grouse and to deconflict its presence with other land users. How do the excess populations of horses and burros impact sage-grouse and other wildlife species, other ungulate species like elk, deer, and antelope?
So, like I mentioned in my testimony, that there's kind of two functions or two pathways that lead to conflict with wildlife. Primarily, as excess horses remove too much vegetation from the landscape, you lose vegetation, which is often forage for those wildlife species, and so they may go without food and or cover. In the case of sage-grouse, they need sagebrush cover, grass cover, etc., to hide their nest, to hide themselves. So that's one possible conflict. The second is space, which I think we ignore oftentimes. And there's some work that's been done in Utah, specifically out on Dugway Proving Grounds by Brigham Young University, where they looked at water, and they found that there was a very strong correlation with horse presence and the lack of use by native wildlife, everything from birds to larger animals like pronghorn, for example. So they can compete both for forage, space, and then also just the overall quality of the habitat or the quality of vegetation.
Do you know about how much sage-grouse habitat might have been affected or degraded by the horse overpopulation?
So in that part of the state, we don't have an active sage-grouse population. You've really got to look to the states of Wyoming and Nevada. They're kind of ground zero for overlap with sage-grouse and wild horse herd management areas. Utah has a little bit of overlap, but not near as much as the other two states.
Once it's been degraded, how long does it take for habitats like these to recover?
That's a tough question. We're still grappling with that. It can take decades for that to recover. A lot of it depends on how the precipitation falls in a given year. But it's safe to say that it's extensive, it's expensive, and it may well take several decades if we can recover some of that. Some of that habitat occurs in fragile enough ecosystems that once it's lost, we may struggle to get it back.
Yeah. And back to the water sources, when you've got horses near this, what are the kinds of impacts it has on other species and their behavior around the water?
So you're referring to the horses' behavior?
Yes.
So there's, again, some work by Dr. Steve Peterson, which suggests that they have documented aggressive displays towards things like pronghorn to keep them off the water, bighorn sheep and elk. Those have all been documented. So horses are certain to make their presence known. I think one of the most critical things that happens is they showed a correlation between temperature. As temperatures increase, daily temperatures increase, then the horses spend more and more time on that water during the hottest part of the day, which is the time of day that a lot of the wildlife are in need of that water. And so often the wildlife are left to wait until the horses vacate the area before they're able to access that water. So it causes additional stress, physiological stress, to the wildlife species that are being excluded.
Mr. Tryon, what impact does that have on the water itself?
Well, it can significantly draw down the water, Mr. Chairman. So BLM is familiar, certainly anecdotally, with the fact that horses are drawn to water, they overcompete other resources, they are more mobile than most of the game species that Dr. Thacker was talking about, and that they can essentially make a barrier between the water and themselves. I'm familiar with some of the literature on this, and generally we're finding that horses in particular outcompete the other animals for water sources.
Mr. Goykachiat, how many of the herds are located on land where the only water sources available are on private land?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in Nevada, there are very few where the water sources are only located on private lands. Part of that reason is most of those areas, when the act was put in, those horses were claimed by those ranchers. A lot of areas do have artificial water sources, and by that I mean wells that permittees own, so those are a private property right, or pipelines that pipe water off of private property onto adjacent BLM land.
In that kind of circumstance, what actions can private citizens take with regard to protecting their private property where they're surrounded by horses that may be looking for water, if they've got a source of water on their land?
Sure. So again, Mr. Chairman, J.J. Goykachiat for the record. Fence out. Nevada is a fence out state. That does become a problem when horses are thirsty enough and resources are depleted enough. We are continuing to see more and more public land interactions, or excuse me, private land interactions with horses. That includes maybe domestic horses that you have on the inside fighting with those horses. When it comes to what can you actually do, a lot of times that ends up in court. The BLM has asked, can you please provide horses the water that you have coming off of your private? Some permittees will. Some won't, but that is a private property right in the state of Nevada, and it is guarded quite closely, as you can imagine, in that dry state.
Horse health, as you know, has become a controversial topic because it can vary significantly from one herd to another and even between seasons. With your background as a large mammal veterinarian, can you give a brief overview of sort of the industry standards by which horse health is measured?
Sure, absolutely. So as you said, it's become a hot button issue. This year, Mother Nature gave us a break. We had a record winter, so we have a lot of forage. The horses don't look bad right now in Nevada. There's a lot of them. I will tell you, in recent years, they looked horrific. I personally had been called upon, I don't know how many times, to investigate horses that were in severe shape, poor body condition. A lot of those did succumb to their nutritional status. Down in southern Nevada in particular, I think a lot of people saw the news and the video that came out of down there. Let me just say, Mr. Chairman, that if that was a private individual that had those horses, I do believe there probably would have been charges brought forward. And that is something that is very difficult for a lot of us to watch. I do not care for my animals that way. My clients do not care for their animals that way. And I beg us to find a way to allow the BLM to not have to care for theirs or ours in that way.
I take it from your answer then that you believe that the size of these herds in some instances has reached a level that makes it negatively affect the well-being of the herds.
Oh, absolutely. Your older horses and your younger horses tend to be the first ones that suffer. Dr. Thacker talks about how these horses get aggressive on water. When there's not very much water, your older, your stronger, bigger horses are going to get that drink first. Your foals, your weanlings, your yearlings, and then your older mares are going to have it last. And if there is not water, they're going to continue to deteriorate in health, and that is what we see happen.
So how would you advise us then to discuss what metrics or language or concepts should we be incorporating into our conversations in Congress about horse health? What should we be thinking and talking about that we're not discussing?
Appropriate management level. Those levels are set for a reason. That is what the natural resource can sustain for those horses. That's why those numbers were established. They are not arbitrary. They are not random. That is the number of horses that can be sustained on that land. And we have got to come back to that. When I give examples of HMAs 3, 4, 5, 1,200% over AML, we are having a negative impact on the health of those horses. If we get them down to AML, we'll have healthy horses on healthy lands. And then we can start applying fertility control and everything else we've talked about.
Have the wild horses and burros in your state had an impact on public safety?
Absolutely. In fact, together I alluded to earlier with the Triple B, for example, that is occurring right now is in large part a public safety gather. We are seeing increased collisions with motor vehicles and wild horses. And in addition, we're seeing a lot of wildlife being pushed away from some riparian areas down into farming ground and ranching ground. And we're so inadvertently, they are being struck by vehicles as well because the horses are kind of occupying our riparian areas in the foothills.
Do I understand correctly that in some areas we're talking about level 1,000% above AML in
Yes,
your
sir.
state? What kinds of conflicts does this cause with management and otherwise?
In most of the areas where horses are that over AML, the conflicts are predominantly with wildlife, those that are remaining at this point, sportsmen and recreationists. The public land grazers are often gone at the point that these horses get to that high of AML. They can no longer maintain their ranching operation.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Hoven.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, how do you pronounce your last name? I know I should be able to pick that up real quick, but help me with it, will you?
Very carefully. Goycochea.
Goycochea?
Yes, sir.
So how do you get to that AML number that's recommended? What would be your recommendations? How do you get there and maintain that number?
So the proposal that most of us sitting at this table have come forward with will get us there. It will take 5-6 years to get those numbers down there, but it is robust, targeted grazing to remove animals down to closer to appropriate management level now. It is the use of fertility control, whatever that might be. In some areas, it's going to be PZP. In some, it's going to be Gonacon. And some, it might be IUDs, SPAY, as those techniques become available. We've got to find a place to put horses for the next decade and a half off range. If we remove older horses and we put them off range, we need some more off range holding to hold those horses through their life. And we have to increase adoptions. We can increase those adoptions or put more into good homes once we get AML down. If we're adopting out 4,000 or 5,000 horses a year, we can manage partly what we're bringing off the range. But until we get those large gathers done, that might be 15,000, 20,000 a year for a couple of years. We're not going to get there with the other tools without doing gathers.
If you could train them, that as far as adopting out horses, the training is nowadays, there was a time when everybody knew how to work with horses. That's not the case. And so much now with the horses is the training. And to get them adopted, you almost have to get them trained to broaden who's going to be willing to take those horses. People don't know how to train them.
You're exactly right, Senator, and there are programs in place now where more of that training is happening. In Nevada, for example, our correctional department does take a lot of horses in from the BLM, and those that are incarcerated do train those horses, and then those horses are sold, and they bring good money. They do, and I know that lawmakers in the state continue to say, if you will bring us more horses, we will build more capacity in, and we will work with you to place more of these horses into good homes.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's a big part of the value. You get a horse that's well-trained, and, like you said, it brings a lot more money, obviously. Which leads me to think that we should give some thought to how we get more training. Does anyone have ideas on how we accomplish, what should we do to help accomplish that? Because I'm convinced that's the key.
Senator, that's such a good question and a good point that you're raising. If I could answer, I think the Mustang Heritage Foundation, which works hand in glove with the Bureau of Land Management, has a great deal of capacity to do more. They can take more horses, they can do more training. They have an incredibly unique storefront approach where they bring horses to local communities where those horses will be desirable after they've received that training. So there's a tool available to us, and this proposal contemplates that and really increases and augments opportunities for training and safe rehoming of those horses.
Do you need legislation to put your proposal into effect, or could that be done?
We do not. We do not. The BLM has the authority it needs to move forward with this proposal.
Well, there you go, Deputy Director.
Senator, if I could elaborate
Sounds like
a little
they've
bit.
given you a turnkey solution. So
You bet.
seriously, though, talk about the challenges to putting something like that in place. Number one. Number two, actually, my number one concern is, have you been out there talking to the grazers? Are you working with the grazers, and are you making sure that you're working with them to make sure that the multiple use is fulfilled as part of managing the wild horse herd? And then two, talk about implementing their proposal.
So absolutely, range management and livestock grazing is a huge part of BLM's history. We quite frequently meet with individual cattlemen and also the associations, and often the conversation turns to wild horse and burro management. And of course, I am aware of instances in BLM's management where we have voluntary resting of livestock grazing that's taking place at the request of the permittee. That's not widespread, but there are instances of that. I wanted to go back to your questions about training, because we have had for years now very active programs with a number of prisons, and that's in California and Nevada and Hutchinson, Kansas, and Colorado, and Florence, Arizona. All of these places, we get a lot of benefit because labor is cheap from the inmates. The inmates get a lot of benefit out of it in terms of the human-animal interactions, and we get some very adoptable animals out of that program. But this year, Senator, first time ever, we have implemented a financial incentive for untrained horses, and it's shown a lot of promise. We're now paying $1,000 to adopters in 2 installments, 2 $500 installments, and it is looking very positive for increasing not just the trained animals that we're adopting, but also the untrained ones.
Is there pushback from, the horse industry, or is that something they recognize working with you makes sense?
Not at all. We haven't had that. And I will also second Ms. Perry's comments about the Mustang Heritage Foundation. It's been an excellent working relationship. They're based out of Georgetown, Texas. They do a lot of great work together with the BLM, and they adopt a lot of our animals for us.
I've seen the prison thing. I think that's just phenomenal. I really like the idea of this incentive for the trainers. I think you create value there. I mean, I think there's a way to, generate revenue from the standpoint you've got a horse now that is valuable if it's well trained.
We think we're creating markets. It's still a little bit new to declare victory, but it's been positive so far.
Well, it greatly expands the possible pool of adopters because they can take a horse that's trained where they can't do much with one that's not trained. So I think it's a great idea. I guess last question I have is, so you are implementing, maybe we got just too focused on training, the overall proposal. He mentioned a number of things. Overall, are you able to implement that proposal, or are there some things that would hold you back?
We absolutely have the legal authority to do it, and we have been active in the training area for years now.
But beyond the training, he had about 4 or 5 steps included. Fertility control, a number of things. Are you able to, the holistic plan they've put forward, is that something you're doing, or are there issues to doing that?
So generally speaking, the coalition proposal, several of the folks that are represented here, we have the authority to do it. It's a level of intensity question. So can we increase the use of fertility control and also increase gather and removal? That's sort of the sweet spot. And with the $80 million appropriation that we're operating under currently, we would have to scale back some of the other gathers in order to have the intensity of operations that would be necessary to have that widespread fertility control. So yes, we can do it. It's a matter of scale.
Which is resource issue or
Yes, sir.
Other issue? Is it other, or is it just a resource issue?
I would say it's a resource issue.
So you're not getting pushback. I mean, obviously, in terms of horse management, I know there's a lot of different people, a lot of different ideas on how it ought to be done. And without going into all that, the main issue, it's a resource issue, not a pushback issue.
Right. And in terms of the basic premise of everybody gathered here, that additional fertility control and returning those animals to the range, we are not getting pushback on that.
Okay, and then from the cattleman standpoint, just your sense of how this is going and priorities and what needs to, the BLM needs to be doing.
Well, what I think Mr. Tryon is sort of not able to probably answer as robustly as maybe some of us on the panel. This is a financial issue. The program is constrained at its current budget. They're spending 50 of their 80 some odd million on the off-range holding of those 50,000 horses that have been gathered. That leaves them very few resources to do more gathers, administer fertility control, and really aggressively triage that population. I think things like trained horse programs are fantastic tools when you have a sustainable population, but I think this proposal contemplates the idea that we really have two different items that we're looking at. We're triaging a critically overpopulated range,
right.
And then what are those long-term sustainable solutions? And that big hit of funding that's needed now, and there's no other way to describe it, to really give them the resources and quite frankly, not to speak for them, but I mean, I would imagine to plan year over year, out a few years, in order to really get some long-range planning about how you tackle this and get down to AML. I think is critically needed if from an outside perspective as a stakeholder. They need those resources and they need the time to really attack it without worrying where their funding's coming from next year.
But that's why I asked if it's just a resource issue, and I would think the chairman might be interested in this too. Are there other obstacles? You talk about fertility control and some of these things that you need to, some of the things you probably are going to need to do to get ahead of that population that you have, get it down to the manageable level so you can then implement a sustainable program that includes all these features. Is there pushback beyond just the funding, or is it just the funding?
There's always going to be pushback, I think, on the flanks, and I won't speak for Nancy or the Humane advocate community. I know there's folks on their flank that are concerned with a lot of these options. Certainly, in my end of the world, there are folks that look at a proposal like this and say, gosh, it doesn't go far enough. I think that's the nature of a compromise, particularly one in an issue that is as loaded a topic as this one is. Right. Litigation haunts this issue like it does every issue in the West, and there's no way around that reality. But I think what we can do as stakeholders that are invested in this is try to make some recommendations, try to work with Congress, try to work with the agencies to find a path that's reasonable and rational to those middle ground users that have to live and work in these environments every day.
I agree, and I think building the coalition and coming up with a holistic plan, it really does make sense, and I thank you for doing that, as well as your efforts, Director, to implement it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hoeven. Mr. Tryon, what's the annual demand for adoption of wild horses?
So in 2018, we adopted roughly 4,600 animals. We're going to increase that number, if not substantially.
What was that number you said?
4,600. I want to say 10 or 15 years ago, we exceeded 10,000 in a year. And so adoption demand has gone down, but I'm cautiously optimistic that the adoption incentive, the financial payment that I mentioned a moment ago, is causing that number to rise again.
This is the 2 installment payments of $500 each.
Yes, sir.
And that's, you do that because it's expensive to care for a horse and you're trying to offset the difficulty of that. That's the idea.
So we spend roughly $2,000 a year to care for and feed a horse. So if we spend $1,000, well, we've already made money for the taxpayers in the first year. Project that out over 25 years that we might hold an animal in holding. It's a substantial savings.
Right. So the program, the cost of the program was about $20 million per year 20 years ago. And then 10 years ago, it popped up to about 40 million. We're now into the, $80+ million a year range. How much could this program cost the taxpayers in another 5 or 10 years if we don't change something about our management practices or about the way it's going?
I think you could look at sort of a range of costs, and it depends upon your optimism about contraceptives and how effective they could be. and holding costs, and whether we can continue to make progress with competition on driving down costs, which we are still doing. And a lot of that depends on things like the price of beef and the willingness of ranchers to enter into the horse market in an up beef market. So a lot of that is hard to forecast. But I will tell you, Congress at the enacted level has appropriated $80 million for this program. We are using money from our Fish and Wildlife Conservation program, from our range management program, from fire where it's appropriate, to rest an area so we can reseed it. And we're essentially running a $95 or $96 million program on the $80 million that Congress appropriated.
You're having to cannibalize those funds from other areas within the Department of Interior, within the Bureau of Land Management.
I'm happy to say that program leaders of those feel that it is an appropriate use of money to get the horses off of the rangelands where they're overpopulated, or to get them out of sage grouse breeding areas. And
sure, no, I understand that. But the point is those programs are then deprived of something that they would otherwise be able to spend on something else.
That's fair.
How has litigation affected BLM's ability effectively to manage the wild horse populations?
Mr. Chairman, it's no surprise to you, but this is a highly litigated subject. I want to say at one point last year, we were subject to more than 20 active cases of litigation. I think that number is closer to 10 now. There would be entire programs of the BLM that had no litigation presently. And so I would say it's a substantial effect. Generally, the target involves our gather operations and how we run them, and what we intend to do with the herd as we manage it over time.
Would you be willing to submit to the committee a list of the proposed actions over the last 10 years that have been litigated?
Absolutely, we can provide that.
Thank you. The 1971 Act gives the BLM the authority to sell excess animals for commercial production. But over the years, that authority has been blocked by a series of annual appropriations riders enacted through fiscal year 2005. And then between 2005 and 2009, there was a brief period in which those appropriations riders didn't apply, and where BLM had the authority to sell animals for slaughter without limitation. The agency didn't do so during that period. Is that right?
I would qualify that a little bit, Mr. Chairman. I would say the agency did sell, but we placed modest limitations in terms of the buyers having to attest that they would not resell, that they had no intention to enter the resale market. So we sold quite a number of animals during those years, but it was with a bill of sale that had a clause in it.
For no commercial production.
Yes, sir.
And why was that? Was that required by law?
It was not explicitly required by the law.
Is it implicitly required by the law?
Well, I was not in the position that I'm in today. My understanding of the intent of the managers at the time was that the public outcry was pretty strongly opposed to sale for commercial purposes, and that we needed to do something to bar that from happening.
Mr. Lane and Ms. Perry, well, we may not agree universally on every aspect of your proposed solution. I applaud you for working to try to solve this problem, and to do so in a way that's humane and that recognizes the suffering that's taking place, and so I applaud you for your efforts. How many years does your plan span? And can you tell me anything about that, or how many holding facilities are contemplated, or what it would do to the foaling rates? We'll start with you, Ms. Perry.
Okay. The proposal's modeled out over a 10-year time period. And as I mentioned already, between years 5 and 6, we reach that equilibrium where horses that are removed are funneled into the adoption program and no longer ever need to go into long-term holding. So there is a savings that's realized at that point. But you're asking about the capacity of holding facilities in general. And that's one of the interesting aspects of this proposal. We believe that by having an entirely non-lethal approach, we can attract a lot of public support to this program. There's a lot of anxiety out there about what the agency will or won't do, given the historic patterns. And so by moving forward with a more unified approach and a humane, explicitly non-lethal approach, we may be able to gain the support of some private entities that would like to be involved in helping. And they would essentially apply for, through an RFP process, becoming those facilities. You're asking how many, and that's a very difficult question to answer because it would depend on how much each of those could hold. But we are aware of at least one organization that's looking into this, has secured property, and is interested in acquiring as many as 50,000 horses. And we believe there would be others. It would obviously have to go through an RFP process, so we have yet to know exactly what will materialize, but we are optimistic.
It would take you about 10 years to get to AML under this plan, is that right?
Well, actually, we don't really get to AML. We get to a better balance. We get somewhere near AML with this 10-year proposal because we didn't want to focus specifically on AML. We wanted to get to a better sense of balance on the range. So the 10 years would get us to around 33,000. So very close.
And then what kind of management activity would be needed to take us from 10 years into perpetuity?
Ongoing management, just as we've advocated for over the years, and that would involve the use of immunocontraceptives, and then we assume technology over that time period will have advanced to the point where these vaccines are very long-lasting. Some permanent vaccines are even being looked into. So the same exact technology that we know is efficacious now for several years could potentially become permanent or could be very long-lasting. So there are all kinds of technologies being developed that would probably be in play at that point, but it would require maintenance. We are not contemplating, the cessation of management of wild horses. This will be an ongoing program.
Mr. Koikichi, how common is the use of sterilization among domestic horses?
Sterilization among domestic horses is very common. I mean, most of our males are, in fact, gelded. In the mares, it's less common, but it is a common practice in some areas. And there's a lot of old cowboys have told me that the best gelding they ever rode was a spayed mare. So it is common practice.
Is it considered safe from a veterinary medicine standpoint?
Mr. Chairman, any surgical procedure comes with risks, and there are inherent risks with any of them. Yes, it is safe, and it is safe in domestics. Restraint becomes an issue, obviously. It is easier to handle and restrain and sedate a domestic mare than it is a wild mare. Now, there are those that are doing it, and they are very efficient and effective at it.
Okay. So, but medically speaking, assuming you can control that factor, the sedation, once you can get the horse restrained and sedated, medically there should be no difference between performing that procedure on a wild mare versus a domestic mare.
The procedure itself, that is correct. There is no difference. Mares are mares.
So why not rely more on that?
There is a post-operative effect, I think, and then there's also an emotional effect that comes into that. The BLM has not proven the efficacy and the safety of that yet through a study. They need to, and I applaud them for continuing to work on that and to try and get that done. But they are being hamstrung right now because that study has not been completed and NEPA has not been completed on that.
Ms. Perry, what are some of the concerns of your organization about the use of sterilization for wild horse control?
Thank you for asking. We certainly think any tool that would be employed under this proposal must be safe, effective, and humane, and we do not believe that has been shown yet with these sterilization techniques. And when we're speaking of mares, gelding is an entirely different story, but for mares, comparing, cats and dogs to wild horses, as has been done in some cases, is not really appropriate, especially you heard Mr. Gogachia's explanation on that. But in reality, one of the other concerns that
What about
arises,
comparing wild horses to domestic horses? Is that
yes,
that
even
is,
there, obviously these animals are much more difficult to contain through the healing process, not used to being handled. Many of them will have a foal by their side if they're a fertile mare, and that's obviously the population you would be looking at. More complicating, there's a very short window in which they're not impregnated. So we would probably be talking about pregnant mares. And I think we get into some very serious and sticky humane concerns.
let's talk about those. What do you mean?
So they would probably already be pregnant at the point a procedure was undertaken.
Right.
Now, it's not impossible that you would find mares that are not pregnant for this procedure, but that's a short window. And so I think there is a great deal of concern about what the implications of that would be for the unborn foal. There could be a risk of infection and even abortion that would occur. And that's obviously not the kind of program that we contemplate for these animals.
So is that one of the concerns, is that it could result in an
a
abortion
loss? Yes.
of an unborn horse?
Yes. There's also a huge scalability issue here. We don't have many veterinarians who are trained in this, nor many willing or interested in becoming involved in that program, as far as we can tell. And talking about the numbers of procedures that would have to be done for it to have any effect at all, it just doesn't seem like a particularly pragmatic thing to chase, especially, again, considering what a lightning rod this will be for controversy. That doesn't mean that it could be...
And most of that controversy, again, relates to the unborn horse?
The risk to the mare herself, there's certainly infection rates that have to be worried about. There's a recovery period. There are concerns about, in particular, the colpotomy approach, which is all of these methods tend to be invasive and can cause bleeding and can cause infection and can cause death. These are concerns that a lot of advocates have. And again, especially when you juxtapose that, Senator, with the volumes of material that show the efficacy and safeness of the vaccinations that are available and how they're more long-lasting now. So we don't even really need to be looking in this direction.
Although it sounds from what I'm hearing today, like there is some debate over that, some debate over how long-lasting these other methods are.
I'm not aware of any credible debate about that, to be honest. I mean, the BLM itself has been proclaiming efficacy of this vaccine over the years. I provided, a number of studies and reports from government agencies, the BLM, U.S. Geological Survey, National Academy of Sciences, stating that this is safe, humane, effective, and the PZP-22 is meant to run for at least a 2-year period and can be as effective out to 5 years with a booster. So this is, and I know that that is already the current generation of the drug. So we are not talking about a brand new technology. It is currently available. It is scalable to the portions that we need. So we feel strongly that these tools are available. I understand there's debate here among some of us on the panel about that, but I would welcome a deeper exploration of the science that is already available on that, because I believe we're on solid ground. And what I would hate to see is for us to chase something that isn't practical, that is highly controversial, and that will cause great delay, because one of the things we're working against is recruitment every year, with new population growth. And so what we need to do is get on the ground with the tools we have now, rather than wait for something to become tested and effective, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. I want to thank the witnesses for coming to testify today. This has been helpful. It's been informative. I want to submit to the record 2 letters I've received, one from the Utah Farm Bureau Federation, one from the Beaver County Commission in Utah. Both of those will be introduced into the record without objection. We will keep the record open for a period of 2 weeks after this concludes, allowing members to submit additional questions should they have any. This has been very informative indeed. There are issues of compassion, and I respect the perspective each of you has brought to the table on this. There are, unfortunately, no easy issues on this, and even though some of us in the room may disagree with the other about what is most compassionate, I think all in the room do have compassion as the issue that they're focused on. I also appreciate, Ms. Perry, the attention you drew to the interest in the unborn horse. Life is significant. The fact that it has not yet been born doesn't make it insignificant, and that's something we should take into account. Thank you very much for being here. We stand adjourned.